Hi, this is like a video about my health concerns and sort of like why I'm mostly focused on therapy. And the last decade, I've been through something very, very traumatic. And however, this is sort of like why, and in a sense, my medical conditions are like an overview of what I'm struggling with. And the first thing to like know is that my family sort of let me care too much of secular products and most entertainment to sort of over appreciate stories or movies or sort of like the latest records and like comic books and sort of like less important things around me. And I was allowed to take things like stories and pop culture much perhaps too seriously and sort of like read comic books all day if I wanted to and talk to friends that were like into role playing games or movies perhaps way too much. And in a sense, I'm a bit uncritical because of that towards should I just sort of like jump into or start thinking too much about what's happening around me and where I should perhaps have been stopped from doing that. But that wasn't really the problem. My parents were just a bit too nice and so on, allowed me a bit too much freedom and something like pop culture, and I'm sort of like a little bit too much into stories and something like video games because of that. Then what I have that's actually a serious psychiatric issue, or could be also in the future, is that I have a delocalization personality disorder where I somehow like morph into the surroundings and sort of take on the culture and also events in things quite distant from myself, or for instance nearby stores and even other countries and sort of like things beyond the solar system, or something like the moon or Mars, or things very, very far away. And you can, for instance, right now I'm sitting here and I'm technically 20 to 25% inside my normal body and focusing on the camera. Then I'm something like 30-40% over in this corner of the room with something like my personality, and then something like 20 to 25% I'm sort of like in this, I have a shrine here and I'm somehow thinking about that. I'm also something like hovering in the shrine or things around me. So I have like a delocalization personality disorder where I'm not sort of like entirely inside myself, and my thoughts are, you could say my personality is like split into like several things around me, but not like schizophrenia. I'm just sort of like, for instance, right now I'm like focusing and I'm like concentrating on the camera. I'm 20-25% there. Uh, but I'm also over there and I'm like in the shrine or some stuff I have over here, and I'm sort of like a little bit scattered and sometimes quite far away. Even yesterday, I was in Britain or like Scotland, and then some like perhaps almost Ireland, and I'm sort of like not in those countries. I'm from Denmark, and I'm sitting in Denmark, but my psychology and most of my personality was in Britain yesterday. Something like 80 to 95% of my personality was somehow way over in Britain. So then after quite a few years of like doing this without really being critical of this process, and that somehow went from being 10 to 15% besides my normal self, and then 50 to 60% in the surroundings, and finally devolved into my current state where I'm something like 90 to 98% of my psyche is somewhere else most of the day, and that sort of pretty much derealized to be in my normal shell, and in a sense where the brain and most of my anatomy and physiology, like my body, is. And also to somehow question or like not fully understand if I should be in my body or where I am or like elsewhere, and so on. Uh, and sort of like it's like my usual meditations and basically how I think most days. And then certain things happened when I was given Abilify that made me question where my personality boundaries were, or in a sense if I should be in my own body, and where this sort of like process of like being elsewhere got accelerated quite badly. Let's see if we can find it. I was given Abilify. It's sort of like approved for, I think, 15 milligrams. I heard that in the hospital, and they have to get permission to give me I guess prescribe 30 milligrams in Denmark, but I was given 45 milligrams when it was just new on the market, and I began hallucinating very, very badly on that very high dosage. And the explanation that I found some articles on the internet is that Abilify is according to Jay Michelson, as a reporter from New York, to be connected with something like LSD experiences. Now here's like a package of Abilify, and he says that it's worth like a ton of money. The best-selling drug in America isn't what you think, that it isn't an antipsychotic, it's something else, and it's a whole lot more powerful than you'd expect. And then there's a package of Abilify over something like LSD patterns. And this sort of like wavy stuff pattern is classic LSD art. One of the most typical things you see when you get LSD is something like your perception starts like moving like waves, or something like acid is dissolving your usual reality. Also why it's called acid. And that this basically, I found a graph that said that theoretically when you get a high dosage of Abilify, it sort of turns into something like LSD according to science. So this is sort of iffy or unproven, but and these images here give like an example down here. These three images sort of like what LSD art is. If you just sort of like let's see here, we can like go on LSD art. You can like see that it's somehow these sort of like patterns and psychedelic waves, and something like this is something like long-term effects of LSD and so on. And these images, this stuff here is something like connected with LSD. And somehow when I got this and I began hallucinating for 3.5 weeks, and I basically tried to commit suicide because I was feeling very bad. And I got it when I was like feeling really, really bad in the hospital without warning also, that somehow I began to sort of like Chris Marks leave my body. And that process, I never really got therapy or something like corrected or somehow told that was perhaps wrong, and it just sort of like got worse slowly because of that. And so like, and if my senses truly stopped at my usual flesh, and even if my devotion or sense of religion, what truly mattered to me, was placed elsewhere, like for instance, is my true like feelings or who I'm supposed to be somewhere like placed in Scotland right now, or perhaps here, I'm not entirely sure. And though I was a little bit this way before, because perhaps my parents allowed me to like enjoy video games and stuff like comic books too much, that somehow when I got Abilify, that made me hallucinate for 3.5 weeks, and I was so terrified I didn't know how to like tell anyone. I was feeling very bad when I got it, and then I hallucinated some terrible stuff, and I began something like existing in the air or the room around me. And after those 3.5 weeks, it somehow accelerated for a few years, where I just somehow left my body almost like 50-60% after a few years of something like having gotten Abilify. And then that has slowly just gotten worse. And then last, that something like I have a rather fatal lack of friends, mostly because of ruthless care from my doctors and also them supporting me being something like a psychiatric loner citizen. They sort of like just walk around in hospitals and don't look for friends, and just sort of like walk around and it's like staring at the walls in something like psychiatric institutions, and prevent me from getting the support and normal ideologies that could have kept me nearer to where most people reside in terms of their thinking or most decisions and reflections. So in a sense, I have this disorder where I delocalize into the surroundings, almost at the level of like perhaps a personality disorder. And it got badly accelerated when I got Abilify somehow, because I hallucinated and got very bad disinhibition, but also somehow began leaving my body when I got Abilify for 3.5 weeks, and it just sort of got worse because of that. Or it started getting, things accelerated, or this somehow devolving or morphing into the surroundings sort of got accelerated quite badly for a few years because of that. So what happened is that I'm also from Denmark, and there's been these unfortunate wars in the Middle East, and where George Bush sadly issued some rather deceptive orders, and had something like the American army attack some countries where that perhaps shouldn't have happened, and that somehow Denmark was involved in the wars in Afghanistan against terror, and also in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, and committed perhaps some rather serious crimes that way, despite it all. Wait a minute, I need to put some food in the oven. And what happened was that Denmark, in a sense, got Chris Marks polluted with rather bad sins, both in something like the political system, but also in the press and among quite a few soldiers. And I somehow delocalized into the sins of something like perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 people, or something like at that level in Denmark, where something like I got something like trapped inside of the guilt gelatinous cube. I somehow, got trapped inside like the sins of my country because I delocalized into the madness and sort of like the war stuff my country had done. And I got something like stuck 40 to 45% inside of something like the sum total guilt of my entire nation because of something like perhaps 100,000, hundreds of thousands of people sort of getting murdered. And the result was that my conscience and my faculties had something like several overlapping meltdowns, and it was basically like throwing me into like several furnaces all at once, and to something like being persecuted or like murdered by demons for like hours every day. And it somehow made me feel like these images, and it began in mid 2014 and has like stopped something like a few months ago. So basically a decade or 10 years I have been feeling like this, and it sort of like happened because I began delocalizing. I got Abilify in 2006, and then that somehow accelerated this delocalization process that I was a little bit into to start with, but then even that sort of like that slowly got worse. And then when in mid 2014, when the evil from the war set in and corrupted my culture and the politics or something like you could say civilization around me, I somehow delocalized into that and somehow got trapped in that rather unwillingly. And the result is that I'm something like delocalized 40 to 45% into something like mass crimes and genocides from my country, and my conscience and my better faculties melted and almost exploded into something like anguish and something like deranged suffering and something like what I call very, very bad PTSD. So that is basically finally over, but I don't feel so good, and right now I just feel a need to focus on therapy and take it quite easy. And I've been trying to like make some tutorials for Flax Engine, but like I tried to make something, and just 8 days ago I just felt so bad I just couldn't do anything. I just sort of half shut down and walked around in circles and just couldn't think or really do anything because I've been feeling this way for like a decade, and I'm just sort of like trying to feel better and something like reconnect with my friends after this very, very traumatic experience, and I'm not fully sure what's happened. And right now I'm sort of like delocalized into something like some houses I walk past, and I know something like halfway across town, and then technically I'm somewhere over like in Estonia or Latvia right now because one of the workers that was here like reminded me of that. She's from Poland, and she's very, very nice. Her name is Caroline. And because I talked to her right now, my thinking or psychology is in Estonia or Latvia, or somehow the sort of like some total madness and evil decisions and politics from the Afghanistan war and so on. Something like as one citizen, I just got somehow like caught up or like inside all of that, something like where your conscience catches fire and tries to murder you. And you could say what happened to Judas, and very, very bad suicidality, and basically very, very traumatic PTSD. And it's lasted something like a decade or 10 years. And I'm trying to feel better after that happening, and that's why I'm like taking it easy, and I'm not trying to get rich or make a ton of money from art. And even if Flax Engine is very nice and people should make some really cool video games, my focus is basically on therapy and sort of like not committing suicide. And probably for the next 6 months, but perhaps several years, that will be like all I got and all I can really contribute with. So that's sort of like, you could say, my crazy healthcare story, and somehow like how I somehow got Abilify and then got somehow delocalized into the sins of my entire country, and for the illegal wars and all the murders and suffering or ignorance that caused in Afghanistan and also Iraq, and sort of like the hunt for WMDs or weapons of mass destruction that sort of weren't there, and it was sort of like almost known globally as like a joke that they weren't there. And I somehow got sucked into all that evil and corruption, and I just didn't know how to like walk away and like what to do about that. And I basically just got tortured really, really badly psychologically, and basically most of my faculties since 2014 and sort of like until now. So I'm just sort of like trying to take it easy and and not really, work too much and just think of like therapy. And that's that. Yeah, thank you. Bye.